Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody online. I hope you can all hear me well. We're now live in Lund in our office, and we're going to listen to Serge Belongie in a few minutes. RISE is Sweden's research institute, nearly 3,000 people working on a wide array of topics. And us in the computer science department and the Center for Applied AI organize these weekly learning machine seminars. This meeting will be recorded, and if anybody wants to be removed from this recording, just let us know. Also, make sure to check out our collection of great talks on our YouTube channel. So, as I mentioned, today I have the pleasure to introduce Serge Belongie, who is a professor at the University of Copenhagen and the founder of the Pioneer Center for Artificial Intelligence, which was started up in 2021, I think. Serge had his PhD from Berkeley in 2000, supervised by Jitendra Malik. He was then professor in computer science at University of California in San Diego, and then he was professor at Cornell and a founder of Cornell Tech. He has also co-founded several companies, including Digital Persona and Anchovy Labs, and he is the creator of Vispedia together with Pietro Perona. Serge is known for his contribution to tasks such as object recognition and image segmentation, and also on bird species identification. Today's topic will be challenges in fine-grained image analysis. And with that said, I will hand over the word to you.
All right, thanks a lot for the invitation and the kind introduction. As Olaf said, I'll be talking about fine-grained image analysis, and I'm representing the Pioneer Center for AI, which is a collection of AI-related researchers from across Denmark, 5 different universities, and it's funded by public-private partnerships. So it's mainly there are private foundations that are supporting this foundation, but I won't be talking too much about Pioneer Center. This is a talk about fine-grained recognition, fine-grained image analysis, and the concept of granularity in general. There is some coverage of past work here, but it's also research directions and provocations to get some conversation started. And I hope we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so of Q&A and discussion so that we can explore some of those directions together. So we'll start by a little bit of the history of fine-grained image analysis, and then go through some of the past work in that area, some of the data sets that are used, including birds, which feature prominently in all fine-grained image analysis work. And then transition into some of these more speculative, open-ended research problems that could become subjects of future PhD theses. So when we talk about fine-grained image recognition, we mean things like species of bird, or something like if you have a leaf of a plant that has disease present or not, it could be the make and model of a bicycle. So these are subordinate category recognition problems. We know the container category, but we don't know the specifics of it. And that's in contrast to generic image recognition, where it would be something like orange versus dog. I think when the deep learning revolution took place, a lot of the work involved coarse-grained recognition on data sets like ImageNet. And it makes sense that the field would progress in that way. But when it comes to connecting with real-world users and real-world interest groups, it's very often the case that people want fine-grained categories. That's what they care about. Now, let's take a look at this spectrum of granularity. So it's an interesting range. This is something put together by Ryan Farrell, another researcher in fine-grained image analysis. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got basic category recognition. So I hinted at that before, something like frog versus piano. And while I can't say any problem is really solved in AI, that side of the spectrum is pretty close to solved in the context of supervised, large-scale, data-driven, whatever the latest neural net or transformer architectures you're using, it's very close to solved on the basic category recognition side. Now we progress through the spectrum to things like birds in general, where you might have penguins and owls and doves all in the same category. So you're getting a little bit of taxonomic information coming in, so it gets finer grained. Then you get into the more subordinate categories, like you've got two different species of finches, one region of Finland, one region of northern Sweden, slight distinctions in the head markings, or in the audio-visual context, it could be that the mating call is slightly different. So now we're getting into subordinate. And then it's controversial whether this last part is actually on the spectrum, but let's say for sake of arguments, if you keep going, you actually hit biometrics. So now you're talking about individuals. So this could be a fingerprint, a zebra pattern, for example, in the context of re-identification for wildlife monitoring. So this is, it's no longer the species or subspecies, it is that individual presence or absence. So, and you can imagine that in terms of learned or manually designed representations, it probably is not a one-size-fits-all kind of problem. What is signal in one case is noise in another case, and vice versa. So this is one of those challenges that we're going to face in fine-grained recognition. So when you get into fine-grained categories, you're reminded that this isn't just about data and computers doing things fast with powerful machine learning methods. Suddenly, you need domain knowledge. You need to talk to the people in these areas to learn what the heck you're looking at. And just to take an example, who knows what this is showing? It's kind of creepy if you realize what it is. These are spider eyes. And we were chatting just before the talk about how interesting when you work with biodiversity or remote sensing, you discover so many interesting problems and people that will tell you so much about their domains. And you can start to forget about machine learning a little bit because it's just so many rabbit holes that you can go down. But these are, this is an entire category recognition problem in its own right. So you get a sense of the way that there's a kind of telescoping effect. Whatever category you're looking at, you kind of explode it, and you look inside that and say, okay, now I can imagine some kind of point-based features, geometric features, and so on that would apply here.
Into some seminar.
And so this is just a, yeah. Was there a question?
I like now go into some deadline, like a CLR or something like that. I'll see now.
Please mute your microphones. I think they're muted now.
Okay. So I think that this is a very early hint that when we talk about coarse-grained versus fine-grained, if your first thought is, well, there's really no difference because to a machine, it's just high-dimensional vectors, labeled training data, same thing. Whether you're talking about orange versus cat or different species of sparrows, what would be the difference? Well, to the machine, probably true. Doesn't really make a difference. It's just numbers. But when you think about how it is that you can get the labels for the training data, suddenly the domain knowledge becomes super important. So one take-home message here already is that when you hear fine-grained, think human expertise. When you think coarse-grained, you could go to a children's book, like a children's picture book, and you can get the knowledge that you need. You just crawl the internet and you get the data you need. But when it's fine-grained, those little details matter. Now take a man-made domain, looking at men's or women's shoes. These are arguably just as taxonomically complex as these other instances in biodiversity. And that's probably not an accident that things turned out that way. But the problems associated with these different domains are different. So in the case of biodiversity, you may have as your downstream task species identification. So your goal is to produce the scientific name of the species that you submitted in a picture. Here, if you spot a pair of shoes or a handbag that you like and you take a picture of it, it's probably not the case that you want that exact item. It's that there's something about the style. So you could say the parts and the attributes of that handbag or backpack are something that you like, and you want to find things that are similar. And that hints already at some interesting aspects of fine-grained recognition, which is sometimes you want classification, sometimes you want retrieval. In some cases, you need it to be interpretable. You want to be able to say, I understand laces and Velcro and straps and heels. These are things that mean something to me as a person. But from the computer perspective, again, it's just high-dimensional data. And the computer has no reason to use things like laces and other sort of explainable AI type things. If anything, it's a tax on its performance because you're forcing it to go through systems like that. So there's already a kind of tension here in terms of how humans might want to use a system that involves fine-grained categories versus the way the machine would be inclined to work with those categories. In the case of food, food was an area of interest for several years in the fine-grained community. The ingredients of the food, prepared meals, attributes of the meal, like the nutritional content, the fat content, and so on. And it's actually fascinating because you can have different cultures, different parts of the world that have essentially the same meal, named different things. And of course, the variety of presentation, the lighting, whether it's photographed on Instagram or by a professional photographer. So it turns out it's a fantastic domain to study. And there's fascinating things like, I'm not sure what the word, like in language, you have synonyms and homonyms. In food, you have things like wasabi versus guacamole, right? They look very similar, but they taste very different. Or you could have a scoop of vanilla ice cream and a scoop of mashed potatoes. They look very similar, but they taste different. And it allows you to study the effects of context and even the way that geographical features can help you with those things. So now I've been hinting at this word granularity. And because if we say fine grain, then it implies that there is a spectrum. So what am I getting at here? First, depending on where you are situated in the spectrum of science and engineering, the granularity that is relevant to you can be very different. So this is a meme, a joke that went around that says biology to a physicist. So this is small. If you're online, I don't know if you can read the little letters, but they all say bird. So every single feature pointing to the bird just says bird. And perhaps even to a physicist, the bird could be approximated as a sphere. I mean, but it completely depends what you're studying. If you're looking at the effects of, or say, electromagnetic absorption, maybe it's fine to talk about a bird as a sphere, and you're not worried about what the different parts are. So this is a situation, when you talk about granularity of analysis, there's no better or worse. It's just a matter of what's appropriate for that study. So if you want to do species classification for birds, or you want to study the life stage of the bird, is it a juvenile, an adult, male versus female? Is it injured? Suddenly you need very high-skilled ground truth labeling. And it necessitates some kind of distance function that respects those kinds of labels. So now you've got high-dimensional data, you've got rich annotations, but now you've got this tension in terms of how you weight them and what's important, what is not important. So I want to keep hammering on this point of human expertise. And I think our field in general needs to do that because AI is getting a huge amount of press these days. And a lot of people are freaked out they're going to lose their jobs and that their expertise doesn't matter. But the devil is in the details in so many areas where AI is starting to move in. And biodiversity is just one of those areas where this kind of
I have a
coarse
question.
interpretation of the world. Does someone have a question?
Yes. So in case of medical image processing, we have tumor images, images which actually evolve from one stage to another stage. That also belong to this category. That means we know that it is evolving from stage 1 to stage 3. And and one more question is related to one-dimensional signal, like a speech signal. And let's suppose it is the speech of the same language, but with different accent. That problem also lie in fine-grained signal processing stuff.
It does. And I'll actually show a couple examples like that. The first one loosely maps onto the concept of life stage, which is one example of a downstream task in the biodiversity setting that isn't just classification. And we have some benchmark challenges that involve a variety of those. So in the case of cancer in a tissue sample, you could have grade and stage. And those are even finer grained than just saying that the tumor is present. And I'll also show some auditory examples. So around the time one of my PhD students, Yin Sui, was finishing, he's now at NVIDIA, he had a year, he'd written so many papers, he was ready to graduate, and he asked me, what should I do for my last year? And I said, you should do something weird and controversial and outside the box. And I said, look, your whole thesis has been on fine-grained, long-tailed data. But somehow we have never defined what fine-grained means. How did that happen that we're almost 10 years into this area called fine-grained visual categorization, and no one actually wrote down what fine-grained means? Now, if we were mathematicians, that would be a cardinal sin. I mean, how can you work on an area that has not been formally defined? But somehow everybody just kind of knows what fine-grained means. You know it when you see it. And so I said, why don't you do a final project that might show that everything you've done before is meaningless? That if you're successful, it turns out that there's no such thing as fine-grained. It's all just high-dimensional vectors and VC dimension and shattering, and none of it matters. And spoiler alert, the paper never got accepted. And this work has never been published anywhere, but we tried to write down definitions of granularity. And it is very hard because there's so many interacting factors. The distance function, the featurization, the domain. I mean, there are so many problems that can be mapped onto the same set of vectors depending on how you label them. And I'm not going to get to any answers in this talk. It's just going to transition to more provocations, and maybe someone will get a spark to pursue some of them. But without looking at any equations here, we tried to cook up some notion of granularity that is just a property of a data set. So what we wanted to say was, if you just give me a data set with labels of remote sensing, fruit disease, women's shoes, all sorts of domains, can we assign a dimensionless quantity to it that characterizes the hardness of the problem? Something in hopes, in continuum mechanics, they have Reynolds number. So if you want to understand turbulence, in the beginning, when you're studying that, you learn something like a Reynolds number. Is there something like that in the context of machine learning where you could say, well, birds and women's shoes are very, very different, but in the context of domain transfer and so forth, is there something that just assigns this number to the data set and says, this is how hard it is. This is the way the categories are separated from one another. And so we cooked up something that's kind of drawing upon clustering theory and so on. But what was interesting is we took a data set, Cub 200 species of birds, And we just extracted 3 different sub-data sets from it. So one of them we call the sweet taster. Oh, I'm sorry, 2 different data sets. The one in the middle is called the sweet taster. So it's 10 species of birds selected from Cub 200, and they were chosen to be visually appealing and very distinct from one another, just qualitatively. And the row at the top is the bitter taster. So those were those are warblers and vireos. And so an amateur would look at those and confuse all of them. So that's our bitter taster. So they're 2 subsets of 10 species of birds. And then for comparison, we looked at CIFAR 10. So that's a well-known coarse-grained object recognition data set. And our measure of granularity ranged from 0.000 up to 1.000. And something that is really fine-grained would be close to 0. And something very coarse-grained would be close to 1. And so it turned out, according to our measure of granularity, the sweet taster was actually coarser grained than this canonical coarse-grained data set. And then the granularity for the warblers and vireos was 0.645. So this is just one data set that had 200 species of birds, but depending on what subset you pick, you get very different performance. And yeah, it's not, we're not bitter the paper got rejected, because it is confusing. This field, we're 10 or 11 workshops deep into the FGVC workshop community. It always appears at CVPR, and no one has really said what fine-grained means. Very strange. So, and part of it.
Can I ask how you measure granularity in that?
Yeah, so I didn't put down the formula for it, but you could look up this archive paper. But if you think back to old papers on clustering cost functions and so on, it's that type of thing. Okay. But I'm not going to cover it. Okay. Now, when we were looking at the pictures of shoes and spiders, it hinted at a class of approach that if any of you have worked on few-shot learning or zero-shot learning, you're familiar with this concept of attribute-based recognition, or parts and attributes. So this was an approach that goes back maybe 15 years, where you, instead of having an end-to-end system, you have a 2-level system. So you say, first, we're going to identify a superset of parts and attributes that supervene on your set of categories, and you identify those first. Stripes, fur, even non-visual things, eats fish. Why not throw it in there? Maybe it manifests itself in some visual way. So you have these attributes that are kind of cross-cutting, and you identify them first, and then you have another layer of classification, which today you would call that fine-tuning, and then you use that to do the final classification. And this kind of approach had a really good run up until the deep learning revolution hit around 2012, 2013. And it was very cool. This was when kernel machines were dominant, so nothing worked that well. But on the bright side, it was very interpretable, because you could actually see if this was cancer cell classification or it's a biodiversity application. You run it through that first layer, you get the attributes, then that gets processed through more classification. You can see where things went wrong. And so you can, one of the appealing things here is you could have really different species, like a hornet or different types of birds that are actually sharing features, because biodiversity has a lot of repetition of, for example, codebook words that seem to recur. And that's really at the heart of this zero-shot or few-shot movement that was really big right before deep learning hit. This also relates to some cognitive science and visual psychology kinds of concepts, like the prototype theory. There are these 2 dominant ways of looking at categories. One is Aristotelian, which is sort of like Venn diagrams or set intersection. And then there's from Eleanor Rosch, the Roschian categories, which is based on prototype distances. So that diagram on the left, that's the Aristotelian view, that you would write down these sort of true or false descriptions of attributes that are present or absent, and then say, if it satisfies this list, then we say it's a robin. And that's really nice from a discrete math point of view, but it had a number of deficiencies that Roche pointed out, and she introduced this prototype concept where if you talk about birds, a robin is archetypical, whereas an ostrich or penguin is somehow less archetypical. And the computational notion of the distance metric that one would need to learn to operationalize this, that was a separate issue. That was something sort of pushed outside that field. In a way, the AI community inherited that metric learning problem. But in psychophysics, psychometric community, they've been thinking about this kind of problem. And it's still unresolved. I mean, there are cases where the Aristotelian view is fine. When it works, it's extremely interpretable. In the case of Roche, the attributes and the parts are sort of mashed together, but you have this notion of prototypes that you understand intuitively. And if you can equip it with a meaningful distance function, then that's interpretable enough. But again, this isn't really a better or worse thing. It's just another way of looking at the problem. So let's look just right before deep learning steamrolled everything. As we got into fine-grained categorization, we asked, how could we tap into the complementary strengths of humans and machines to do this difficult subordinate category recognition problem? And so just to recap on the left, that kind of task, the coarse-grained categorization for that image on the left, is it a chair, is it an airplane? That's very easy for humans. At the time, it was hard for computers. The problem in the middle, that's hard for humans to know that that's a finch or an indigo bunting. But the problem on the right, if instead of asking what is the species of this bird, you key in on parts and then ask about attributes, it now becomes easy for people to answer that question. So we pursued this so-called visual 20 questions problem back in 2010, which kicked off the Visipedia project. And so here, the human and the machine work together. So at first, computer vision takes a crack at the categorization problem. 200 species of bird. You have this probability of class given the feature vector X. So computer vision tries to get it right. It's still rather uncertain. And then based on that set of soft predictions, you select a question to ask the user to maximize the expected information gain. So the question number one is different depending on what is supplied to it. So it may ask, is the belly black? Possibly one more question, and then you get your high certainty answer. So this was a case of humans and machines working together to get to the answer. And we showed the way that this can give you good performance with a modest number of questions to ask. And that's just a snapshot of what the Cub 200 data set looked like. But then came deep learning. So I have this funny name called antediluvian. It's a play on the word antediluvian, which means before the flood. So the antediluvian papers, which Kale probably remembers, they use things like histograms of feature vectors, histograms of color, and or hog features and SIFT and things like that. And students today probably don't learn any of that unless they have really old professors. So basically, deep learning just destroyed all of this because these were manually designed representations. And these days, we learn the representations. But at first, so this is now going back to 10 years ago, I wasn't ready to let go completely. I said, all right, this deep learning is super powerful, but there's no way that it could handle all the articulation of the bird. The bird is so flexible. And how, just combinatorially speaking, how could deep learning handle all the ways that a bird could be articulated? So I just assumed we still needed to do the part detection. Surely you must have to find the head and the body and the tail of the bird, and then run those through some deep network and assemble them again in a sort of 2-layer network. And we did get the top performance for maybe a 6-month period by using that. But the deep learning community said, well, you're just not using enough data. So, just add a million more images of birds, and now you don't need to do part detection anymore. And so that at that point, it was just game over. And I mean, all of us let go. I mean, anyone who didn't retire at that point had to just get on board. But it was kind of sad because there was so much work happening with parts and attributes, which I think we know that our colleagues that are in different domains of science, they like the parts and attributes, because that's the way that we can communicate with one another. But if you're just focused on that bottom line, which we have to be to get our papers accepted, the interpretability just flies out the window. And now we have this bizarre sub area of AI called explainable AI and interpretable AI, where we're frantically trying to put these afterburners on AI systems and explain what the hell they're doing. So you can tell I kind of miss those days, but we have to be practical. So I hinted at this difference between categorization and retrieval. And we all know about retrieval, whether we think of it like this or not. But when you use Google to do, at least I hope Google has a few years left before ChatGPT kills it completely. But when you're searching on Google, you are retrieving hits, and there's some number that fill your screen when you get those responses back. And that is an information retrieval problem. It's not a classification problem. So in principle, if you say, I'm feeling lucky, and you get the top hit, you could interpret that as a classification problem, but it's really retrieval. And there is a notion of a metric behind the scenes in terms of how far apart things are. But you can have fine granularity in the context of classification, like I've been describing it, or in the context of retrieval. And one subtlety about retrieval is that psychometrics matter. And what I mean is that if the retrieval interface fills the screen with, say, 25 possible hits, and the correct one is number 15, and your visual system spots that and it's correct, that is a success. It's not a bad thing that it wasn't number 1. It's just there on the screen, and your visual system is highly parallel, and that's a win. And think of that from a remote sensing perspective. If you're looking for some unique thing in a satellite image, it is a success if your collaborator is able to find what they need with an interface like that. That kind of thing is hard to manifest in a classification context. So there's an interplay between the psychometrics and the underlying representations. So again, that's not a hard distinction. The back end in terms of machine learning is quite similar, but it hints at something I found pretty profound that I just spotted online recently. And this was first just said in the context of Yahoo versus Google. But he said, all curation grows until it needs search. All search grows until it needs curation. So many of you weren't born when Yahoo was big, but before Google took over, Yahoo was the index of the internet. So like circa 1995, that's where you went to find anything. So they had this taxonomy or ontology hierarchy, and it was like a yellow pages that you just flip through and find things. And the internet started to grow really big. And then Google came along and just cut the Gordian knot and said, nobody's got time to go through that interface. It's just search. It's a little bar and you type it in and you search. And then eventually search got super overwhelming. There's too much stuff. There's too much search engine optimization. And then history repeats itself, and suddenly people want curation again. So think of going to a really big city like Stockholm or Copenhagen. You land there, you want to get dinner, you do a search, there's 1,000 hits. So now you need curation. So there's this interesting phenomenon here that's constantly going back and forth. And I hinted at this appetite that our community has for explainability and interpretability. And I think that's a hint, that's hinting at this kind of thing, that we have so many powerful features and this ability to retrieve huge amounts of data, but it's overwhelming and we need some kind of curation. But curation brings in massive requirements of expertise. There are issues involving trust. Who is doing the curation? Do they have conflicts of interest, et cetera? So one of the main data sets that we've worked with in the Visipedia project is iNaturalist. This is something that's both fine-grained and long-tailed. So you already know what the fine-grained part is. The long-tail part just says there is not a uniform distribution of these organisms around the planet. A citizen science endeavor like iNaturalist gets massive amounts of photos of monarch butterflies. They simply don't need any more. Their models are saturated with that. But this kind of bug over here in New Zealand doesn't have that many examples. And this is a pattern that repeats a lot in nature. I have other snapshots of data sets. I'm not going to go into that. But that old Cub 200 data set, it has been completely, again, I can't say it's been completely solved, but it basically has been saturated. I mean, the deep learning end-to-end approaches absolutely nail that problem. And I think a lot of these supervised learning problems have similarly been nailed like that. So let me skip that. This FGVC workshop that I hinted at, that's the gathering place for all these fine-grained communities. It's where machine learning people convene with domain experts in biodiversity and fashion and architecture and gastronomy. So we get together and curate these data sets and these challenges. And initially, they were really focused on the classification problem. And now we're talking about more downstream tasks. Downstream tasks like what is the life stage of the organism? How many of the organism are there? That's subitization, behavior, interactions. I mean, you can induce learned representations from a classification problem, but then you can ask, how are those representations useful for other kinds of tasks? So this data set called Newt is an example of that. And we studied how effective those features are in different settings. There's also Merlin Sound ID. So here we're putting together audio and video to classify birds. But it's kind of bizarre, but the audio is not treated like audio. It gets turned into a spectrogram, which is an image, and then run through an image recognition pipeline. And for someone like myself that got started in DSP, I'm very uncomfortable with this because the audio signal processing community worked a long time to develop audio native approaches for recognition. And then along comes the deep learning hammer, turns it into an image, and then classifies it. Very bizarre, but as usual in deep learning, it works well. We don't know why, but it's absolutely delightful for the birding community. So we're getting close to the end here, and I want to recap on where we are in that categorization spectrum. I haven't really said much about re-identification or biometrics, but in a setting like conservation, you do care about re-identification. Has this elephant been seen before, this specific elephant? And what about problems like novelty detection, out of distribution? So these are things where you're saying, I know something about the domain, but I want to know when something unusual has appeared in the field of view. Well, what does that mean? Unusual relative to what? And so this, there was a really nice workshop at ICCV last year called the Out of Distribution Generalization in Computer Vision workshop. And here, they, instead of trying to approach it as a one-size-fits-all problem, they said it manifests in many different ways. So if you're going to talk about out of distribution, whether they use the terminology or not, it's the case that it's different packages of attributes that are present or absent. So you could say it's out of distribution with respect to the pose, right? So you know it's a face, but there's something about where the face is looking that makes it out of distribution. And that goes back to that idea that there's no signal and there's no noise universal distinction. It's depends on your task. So the part, now we're just really getting speculative here. I have these ambitions or this desire that at some point we will find unification, some theoretical framework that says all of these problems, like anomaly detection, open set recognition, the concept of nuisance variables. What are the variables that are irritating and making the problem hard, and the features that we treat like signals? Those roles can just swap back and forth depending on what you're trying to solve. Just to take an example, there's something called the Tai-Sing Lee effect at the bottom left. Those are two different people. There's 4 pictures and 2 different identities represented. And never mind what the distance function is, but this thing is showing that you can take 2 people of different identities, but the same facial expression, and the similarity is higher for those 2 different identities than for the 2 pictures of the same identity to themselves. So this is a backdoor risk when you're talking about biometric systems, that someone, if they're able to register their face with a weird expression or put down a fingerprint in a strange position, if they can get registered and someone else knows that, they could get through the system because you're spoofing it through quirky attributes. So, and the biometrics community has developed this fascinating mapping of this. They call it the Doddington Zoo. And they call, those fingerprints, your face, they call them things like sheep and lambs and goats and wolves that characterize their vulnerabilities, their aggressiveness, the potential of one biometric template to consume another one. This is way beyond type 1, type 2 error. This isn't just false accept, false reject. This is a rich, hidden world of ways that things can get confused. Anyone who's worked on metric learning knows that you have to confront this problem of disentanglement. If you're looking at fashion or biodiversity, you look at how 2 entities are similar to one another. Depending on how you're weighting the features, you could get completely contradictory results. So there's way more questions than answers here, but somewhere in here is this notion of granularity along all these different axes, and simply the question, are you paying attention to it or not? Is it important or not? And if we can get that on a solid ground, I don't think all of these have to be totally distinct problems. You could just say, like right now, you could ask, why is the anomaly detection literature so confused right now? Well, they probably haven't written down a formal definition either, probably because it's so task dependent, right? Is it financial time series prediction? Is it multi-camera surveillance systems? Is it disease on coffee beans, right? These are all completely different. So I think mostly, computer vision is an empirical field, but there are opportunities for some theory here. I think there is a nice unification opportunity. I don't know how to get there yet, but I want to put those provocations out there. So I'll just conclude here and say, there was a point with fine-grained image analysis where people might have just claimed it's solved. The data sets have been saturated. And perhaps that was partly true in the context of this narrow classification problem. But then it revealed a whole bunch of other problems involving downstream tasks and that whole family of problems I just showed. So it's still wide open. We've had 10 FGVC workshops. We're probably going to have 10 more. Unless we totally solve the unification theory, and then we don't need them anymore. But I will stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Serge. And the floor is open to questions.
Yes.
So one question or comment, when we talked about the definition of granularity,
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's difficult to make it on a pure definition based just on the raw data.
Yeah.
Because for me, it seems like I am considering like the whole object set of objects in the world. And then in my own sort of taxonomy, you would have things and then animals. Yeah. And then, so within that, my own conception of that taxonomy, I consider what's fine grained and coarse grained. So is that something that one could work with?
So that's why the paper got rejected 3 times. Is that we somehow know that it depends on the context and the downstream task, but we still wanted to quantify it in some way.
Yeah, based on the raw data, and the labels and the sort of images.
But of course, it depends on the distance function. It depends on the featurization. It depends on the downstream task. And there's probably some incompleteness theorem that relates to it that says you can achieve any granularity for any data set and any labeling. I don't know that for sure, but it could just be completely meaningless the way that we attacked it. But I just think we haven't figured it out yet. In other words, what you just described doesn't fill me with despair. It just means we haven't attacked it in the right way, because there is structure. It's not arbitrary how people look at it. But yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned on this last slide that one future direction is going beyond static images.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned multimodality.
Yeah.
But another thing sort of beyond static is sort of embodied systems and having sort of systems that can look from different viewpoints.
Yes.
So the most of what you talked about today was like static data sets. You have one viewpoint images and you're quantifying this granularity and so on. But I guess if you change viewpoints, things might change in terms of visual distinctions between 2 different birds, etc. So I'm wondering if you have any comments or like thoughts along the active vision combined with fine-grained analysis.
Yeah, so my PhD student, Ryan Ben Malik, focused on that problem. So things like test time training, glimpses, reinforcement learning paradigms that would say maybe the view that you had you just got unlucky, it's uninformative. And if you're working with a very low capacity model, but you're able to move a millimeter, then you accumulate a little bit of baseline, it gets much better. I think, again, the sledgehammer response of deep learning is you just didn't have enough data. And the only way Ryan was able to pursue that agenda was to say, we're talking about low power, low resource systems. And then the reviewers would sort of sympathize with the problem. But in general, people would say, oh, come on, just throw more data at it. And these days, people are synthesizing the data. So if you say, I don't have enough pictures of any object, just synthesize 1 million more, right? Very unsatisfying.
Yeah, you had one of these graphs with the long tail distribution, and you said something in that that type of shape sort of comes up all the time.
Yeah.
But it seems that it had different regions there in this. It's sort of it's a log graph.
You're wondering if that level, does that repeat all the time, or is it just the long tail aspect?
Yeah.
I actually don't know. And there's iNaturalist is a social network. So it's controversial within the biodiversity community because a lot of tech geeks use it, and it's very they populate a lot of the biodiversity map around big cities. So people will go on hikes around San Francisco or Boulder, and they're just hammering the system with these, rock pigeons and monarch butterflies that they don't need. And then meanwhile, there's serious scientists that are part of the network too, and they're operating around here. It's a weird distribution. So I don't want to read too much into that. Yes.
Is in what way is that a problem? Like, does there exist labels for where it's taken? Can't you just filter that out in post, or just balance?
Yeah. Okay. So the thing, in a nutshell, what is controversial about iNaturalist versus eBird, for example, is that iNaturalist is presence-only data. So every occurrence that is fed into the system is the presence of an organism and a geotag. And one could argue that to be responsible in a biodiversity context, you must report presence and absence data. So, and you can't be lazy when you do that. So that would mean that you show up in a geographically identified area, and instead of just saying, I saw this mushroom here, you have a list of 19 other things that you have to check if they're present or absent. So the stereotype of the INAT user is they don't have time for that. Like, you should be grateful they reported anything at all, right? So you've got the presence only community and the presence and absence. So now you have a geospatial modeling problem, and it's great if you have presence and absence, but you just don't have that much of it. So there's a very interesting direction. Oisin McKay at University of Edinburgh is studying whether you can get the benefits of presence and absence data if you have enough presence only data. And even touching that problem is a hot button issue. Yes.
Now, you had self-supervised learning in one of the bullets at the end there.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking back sort of in the data approach, just tossing more data on the problem. So I'm thinking sort of this big self-supervised models, but now incorporating a lot of classification tasks, and segmentation, things like that. Are they not just missing some of the fine-grained things? So it's just we have to make an even larger model, or is it sort of, am I being silly then?
Yeah, so this is another one of those things that's very different for fine-grained and coarse-grained. So I use the term self-supervised, but there is no such thing as self-supervised. The supervision gets in through the side door. The self-supervision uses augmentations that did not drop out of the sky. Someone coded that into the system. Small rotation, RGB perturbation, thin plate spline warp. These are not arbitrary. It's just that it's out of fashion to admit that you're doing that manually in your distance function. So instead, you just blast the system with these augmentations and pretend that they fell out of the sky. But those are absolutely supervised. If you now are talking about, so if you're doing coarse-grained categorization, then do those augmentations all you want and do your contrastive learning, get your self-supervised representations. But if you're doing fine-grained, then the off-the-shelf augmentations could completely obliterate the fine-grained distinctions, which means that whether we like it or not, we have to go back to the domain experts and say, okay, we do need you. Tell us what are the modifications that can happen that still stay in the equivalence class of this species. And they'll say, oh, look who's back. You know.
Yeah. Have anyone looked at that, to doing those augmentations that could preserve fine-grained?
I don't know anything specific. I think this is the time to be doing that because this is the dominant paradigm now. But I'm always in a bit of a battle to get people to pay attention to fine-grained categories because it falls into the long tail of human populations. Everything in society follows that kind of curve. So when the big press releases come out from the big tech companies, they're talking about the coarsest cases, the ones that are the broadest in impact. But all of the little interest groups that make up the rest of the mass of that curve, their needs are not being met. And it's for so many different reasons, which then goes back to why I want this unified theory of granularity, which is to say, all you separate little communities, you share something. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm almost certain that they're dealing with the same small manifold of problems if we can figure out how to characterize it. But right now, it's like this long tail of completely distinct problems. And they're looking at these massive advances in generative AI and saying, it does nothing for me. Like a paralegal working in a law firm, it's like, wow, ChatGPT seems so amazing. And then they use it, and it's like, gosh, it looks sort of correct, but it's wrong in every way that matters. And what are they going to do? Complain to OpenAI? Oh, right.
Perhaps a question jumping onto that. Do you have any ongoing practice regarding applying the generative AI for the fine-grained image analysis? And what's your perspective in that way? Thanks.
Yeah. So our ICCB 2023 paper is on class-specific tokens for diffusion models. And that's a case where when you get fine-grained, the terms like striped or spotted or ambiguous words like bank or stream or whatever, that creates huge problems with the image synthesis because they have all these different interpretations. And it's not like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion is going to tell you, I'm confused about what you said. So in the case of fine-grained, the details of the terminology are very important. So that ICCV paper is tackling that problem. But the FGVC community in general has that problem everywhere, that the granularity of the tokens is completely different than what these dominant LLMs are handling these days. Do we have some more questions from the online audience? Otherwise, I think we'll say thank you to the online listeners, and thank you to Serge. We'll welcome you back next week. We'll have Joachim Lindblad, who is a professor at Uppsala University. We'll be talking about trustworthy AI-based decision support in cancer diagnostics. With that, goodbye, Zoom users.